Well, welcome to this video from St Andrew's Church. A few weeks ago we held a special evening service here at St Andrew's where we asked the question, if God, why COVID? If God, why COVID? We were delighted and privileged that evening to have Dr Sharon Dirckx come and speak to us. Sharon is part of the OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which is based just a few minutes down the road from where we're sitting now. And Sharon and her family are also part of the church family here at St Andrews. And Sharon spoke to us that evening on that question, if God, why COVID? We had a little time as well afterwards for Q&A with those who were there and those who are watching online. But as we talked afterwards, we recognised that these are big questions that people are asking. And they're not necessarily questions we could answer in the 15-minute window we had after the talk. So what we thought we'd do is we invite Sharon back. And Sharon, thank you for coming back. We're really grateful for that. We've just got a little bit of time now to answer some more of those questions that came in on the night and questions that have been bubbling up around them as well. So other questions people have asked us since then. So Sharon, thank you for being here, and thank you for giving us a little bit of time as we wrestle with this question, if God, why COVID? So I wonder if I can start off with a question that came in on the evening. And this question starts by referencing Stephen Fry. So lots of people will maybe have heard Stephen Fry talk. He's quite vocal in his criticism of Christianity and the Christian faith. There's a quote that I found from him where he kind of poses the question, why would you believe in a God who creates a world so full of injustice and pain? And you can tell when he talks about it that this is a real issue for him. You know, he's not blithely saying these things, that these are real questions for him. And the question that came in when you were speaking was kind of regarding Stephen Fry, and it said, as much as I want him to be wrong, I can't see the flaw in his rationale. Effectively, why does God, who is almighty, why does he allow suffering?
Yes, and I think it's a really heartfelt question. You know, as you say yourself, you know, you can tell by the tone in Stephen Fry's voice that this isn't just an intellectual question for him. This is a real question of the heart. And so one of the things that I tried to say near the beginning of my talk, although I know that on some versions those first few minutes were cut off, but I tried to make the point that if God doesn't exist, then we're left with a world of kind of physical forces and matter, and essentially this is just the way the world is. And so if God doesn't exist, then life kind of happens. But that doesn't seem to make sense of our emotional response to it, and it doesn't even make sense to see Stephen Fry's response. Why get so emotional about a God he doesn't even believe exists? And it's actually the Christian faith that makes sense of that heart response by saying, actually, there is something wrong with the world. You're right in your intuitions that this is not right, but that finds its heart in a God who is good, who has made a good world, but that world has somehow gone wrong as well, that there's a brokenness also built in from very early on, and evil also exists and leads to all kinds of suffering. And so these things actually find their kind of home in the notion of a good God, but also a world in which evil exists. And that is really what the Christian faith says, that good and evil both exist alongside each other, not as equal and opposites, but God is good and is greater than the powers of evil, but these two are at play alongside each other. But then the next question really from Stephen Fry is really to do with the character of God. What kind of God are we talking about? And he describes God as perhaps being capricious and you know, we think about, okay, what would it mean then if God was actually capricious and behind the suffering? Well, it would mean that he is the one that's actually causing it. He is the creator of evil, as I guess, and the one that is kind of malevolently at work in the world. But actually, the biblical response to that is that God is actually good and has created a world with the potential for evil, but in its initial state it was without it, but it had this potential for evil. And you might say, well, why did it have that potential? Well, that's because God kind of built in another primary good in the world, which is that humans have the dignity of freedom. Actually, not just humans, but the angelic host, the angelic beings as well. And that's actually a better good than if God kind of just made us all automatons or as kind of puppets that can't even choose whether to do good or evil. But God has actually initiated a greater good of dignifying us with freedom. And it's through the exercise of that God-given freedom, arguably in the angelic realm and also in the human realm, that made the potential for evil an actuality in the created world. And that's actually, I mean, the origins of evil are deeply mysterious. The Bible doesn't say a whole lot about them. In the very earliest kind of descriptions of humanity, there's kind of evil is present already, and the Bible says very little about how it got there, but there are kind of indications from Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, and Jesus mentions it as well, that there may have been a kind of an angelic being that was made good, but then fell and is termed Satan. And so what we see is actually God has made a world good with the potential for evil, dignified humans with the good of human freedom to live a meaningful existence, but then in the use of that freedom, things became broken. And then the rest of the biblical narrative is kind of a rescue mission of this God to people by actually facing that evil head on himself, absorbing the world's evil on the cross and rising again, so that evil never has to have the last word in our lives. That doesn't sound to me like a capricious God who's out to get us. It sounds like a God who's trying to make a world with the greatest possible good. But also there are consequences of that. There are ramifications of that. And humans are not blameless in it. But God has made provision for us in Jesus Christ. That sounds like a God who loves people and has gone to the, as far as he possibly can to rescue us.
Yeah. Thank you. I wonder if I can just pick up on a couple of things from what you said. And the first is really relates to a question that came in again on the night, which was, where has this pandemic come from? Does it come from God, or has it come from, and the question used Satan, which is one of the terms in the Christian faith that's often interchanged with the devil or Lucifer. Yes. You talked about the angelic realm, that sort of other realm that we don't necessarily see. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that question of, well, where's this come from? Is it from God? And if it's not from God, is it from this angelic realm, or is it from somewhere else?
Yes. I think that's a very good question. We talk about things that are in some sense a little bit beyond our grasp. What I would say is that there are always multiple factors playing in, and what we need to be clear on is, so often when people are talking about why would God allow suffering, we're often talking about how people behave to each other. And so, so one type of evil is moral evil that affects how we behave. But in terms of the pandemic, we're talking about a different kind of evil, natural evil, as it were, evil that is resident within nature itself. And that might be in the form of natural disasters such as earthquakes and tsunami, but also disease and sickness and pandemics such as the coronavirus. But of course, with all, when we think about natural disasters and the kind of the way that we try and make sense of them, there are very often multiple factors at play. Now, if we think about the coronavirus, one of the points that I made in my talk is that viruses, it seems, are actually vital to life. And there are kind of fragments of viral DNA throughout the human body in Homo sapiens, and they've been there for, deposited there over evolutionary time and have lots of beneficial functions in the human body. Without viruses, life would cease to exist. And so there's actually something that good about them that is built in. But of course, you say, well, then why are there this small number that are pathogenic to human beings? And it seems like we can sort of, as the more we dig down underneath it, and there's lots we could say about biochemistry and virology on the surface that's very, very helpful. But we do end up coming to this question, but then why are there some that bring about suffering? And I think that's where that's where I land in my, that's where a theological perspective is so important, to say, look, there is something wrong with the world, and it affects our very biology, and it affects the natural world. But of course, it's not as simple as just those two things. Human activity is also involved. We could say that more broadly for other kinds of natural disaster. We often exacerbate these things, even though there are harmful things in the natural world. We have sort of exacerbated their effect, and we could talk about all sorts of factors with the coronavirus, like, that it's been known that wet markets are breeding grounds for harmful viruses for a long time. It comes from the mistreatment of animals, putting them under stress. That is avoidable. We could also talk about how perhaps knowledge of the virus was suppressed. Who knows whether it was or not? That was avoidable. And so however much it may be that there is a brokenness built into nature, humans undoubtedly add to the suffering through our choices, good and bad, mostly bad. And so it's not as simple as is it the forces of evil, is it God's will? But I think clearly God is allowing this to happen. I don't think he is any less in control. But also, there are forces of evil. There are humans using their free God-given choices. And so all of these different factors are at play.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I wonder, so you said just there that God is allowing this to happen, and that certainly within the Christian framework is our sort of, I guess, how we view what's going on to some extent. But I wonder, so lots of people will ask the question, well, why is he allowing it to happen? And actually, maybe we can understand the idea of free will, and we can understand the idea of God not making us robotic. But equally, when we look at the number of people who died and the sheer chaos that this pandemic has brought to so many, we might ask the question, well, why doesn't he just stop it? Why doesn't he say, well, actually, this one is just too serious, and this time I'm going to intervene and stop it.
Yes.
And I know lots of us who have faith pray regularly for God to stop the virus. That's a prayer we come to often.
Yes.
And we hold that intention with the fact that it is allowed to continue. So I just wonder if you could unpack a little bit that idea of what it looks like for God to allow the coronavirus, but also how we view that from a Christian perspective.
Yes, and I think there were some particular phrasings of the question about kind of life to the full, and this doesn't allow me to
so what is it?
Have life to the full.
And that question, just for those, because I think it's an interesting one, is there's a part in the scriptures where Jesus says, I've come to live among you that you might have life in all its fullness.
Yes.
And the question was asked, well, this doesn't really look like life in all its fullness at the moment. This feels like a really difficult part of life.
Yes. I think this is a really heartfelt question, and one of the first things I did want to say was about the need to pray. It seems that God doesn't just kind of zap the world from his kind of mighty throne, but he actually works through the prayers of his people. We are told, that one of the most famous prayers is the Lord's Prayer, that says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, and also deliver us from evil, which means that there are other kingdoms that want to set up and reign on this earth, and there are competing wills other than the will of God, and there is in a sense evil, and so our part of what it means to be a Christian is to stand against that and to pray for God's will to be done, and which means that God gets done what he wants done, rather than what other forces want done. And so what are we praying for in this? And I think I agree that there are some praying for the virus to come to an end, but actually that is often further back. We're often praying for just to kind of get through the day. And actually that's really important as well. But I do think there's a place for what you might call impossible prayers. You know, how much of our prayer life is actually impossible things that if they were answered, it could only be God. It couldn't have been just a coincidence. It couldn't have been just the way the day worked out. And so I think God is asking us to pray impossible prayers. And there's something in that tied in with, you know, life in all of its fullness. It's worth kind of asking ourselves the question as Western Christians that are used to a fairly comfortable life, what life in all its fullness means. And I sometimes think perhaps if we spoke to someone from the persecuted church, we might learn more about what that means. And the truth is that people, and Christians in particular, have struggled with trials and challenges all through history. And Jesus was very direct about this. He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And he says that, you know, and precisely because there's this, you know, cosmic struggle going on between these forces of good and evil, that of course there are going to be trials and there are going to be temptations. And actually sometimes we can be tempted to think, if only I can just get over this, then I can get on with how life is really supposed to be. But it seems to me that the model of the cross is that God actually conquers evil through it, through suffering. And there's something about actually what does it mean to be with God and journey with God in this? I think when it comes to its heart, life, what does life to the full mean? You know, in our natural bent, it means kind of being able to live the life that we want to live. But actually, I read the words of Jesus and say, to be a Christian is to take up my cross and follow him. It actually means to die to my own desires, to die to my own wishes, to die to my own plans for my life, trusting that the God that made me has a plan and has plans that are for my flourishing and for this fullness of life. And I am fullest when I am closest to Jesus. Now, if this pandemic results in me or others, you know, throwing ourselves upon God again and saying, we cannot do this, we are drowning in Zoom and homeschooling and whatever it is, I can't do this. I need you. If that causes me to pray with a depth that I haven't prayed for a long time, then that is not a waste of a global pandemic. If that also causes me to see the power of God at work in new ways, then that is not the waste of a global pandemic. And if this also causes me to love my neighbour in new ways, then that's by no means a wasted pandemic. And so our definition of fullness of life and God's definition are not necessarily the same thing. But God is for human flourishing, but he says, look, the parameters for that are not always intuitive to us. And sometimes he does allow things to happen because it does cause us to cast ourselves on him again in new ways. I'm not saying that that's him causing it for that very reason. There's like a primary good and there's a derivative good. There's a secondary good that C.S. Lewis talks about that God can bring out of difficult times. That doesn't mean that's the reason for it, but he can bring good. And actually what we see historically is that on the back of a number of the pandemics in history, there have often been revivals. And partly because the Christian survival rate was actually greater, despite them risking their lives. And by the way, far, far greater numbers of people died in those pandemics. We're talking 50 million at the beginning of the 20th century, far more than died in the First World War. But we see that actually they have formed the basis of a significant move of God, partly through people seeing the practical demonstration of love by the church when everyone else had sort of fled for the hills. And so God can bring good out of great suffering, and that might be one of the reasons why he's allowing it to happen. The church in the UK is not, I mean, the state of our nation spiritually is I think, quite far from God. But what we've seen during this time is actually, well, if we just look at Alpha alone, more
Yeah.
people signing up for Alpha than any other time in the last few decades.
Yeah.
It does seem that God can, use a time like this to remind us of our mortality and to cause us to ask bigger questions.
Yeah.
Is there more to life than just getting through this day?
Yeah.
And of course, none of that is to kind of diminish the heartfelt grief that people are feeling as they grieve loved ones and grieving not having seen loved ones for so long. This is an awful time, but God's ways are not our ways, and He can bring good somehow.
That's really helpful, thank you. And you made a point there which I think is really important for us to remember, which is, I've heard a few people say questions along the lines of, I can totally see how God is using this pandemic to help us and to maybe call us back to a different understanding of fullness, but why does He have to use a pandemic to do it? Almost couldn't there be a slightly less difficult way for us to learn these lessons? And I think that feels to me like a really, again, a genuine question, but I think what you were saying about that fact that God hasn't caused this, but He is using it to teach us and perhaps to shine lights on certain things that He wants us to reflect on. And I think I think that's a really helpful way of looking at it, because I know a number of people have said, well, if God wants to, to change our practices or to change the way we do things, there must be an easier way of doing it.
I mean, I think, that question is really interesting. If I look at my own life, when life is going fine, it is easy to kind of coast.
Yeah.
When life gets a little bit harder, we press into God a little bit more.
Yeah.
When life gets really hard, we're on our knees. It is the human way often that the extent to which we press into God is the extent to which, humanly speaking, it's not working.
Yeah.
And so I think there is something in that. And then I just can't help but think of the words of Jesus. I mean, essentially in Gethsemane, the night before He was crucified, He was basically saying, God, is there another way that you could do this? Is there another way that you could accomplish your purposes and reconcile people to yourself? If there's any other way, please let it be that. Yeah. And God says there's no other way. And so if Jesus went through that for us, then I want to live in the fullness of that. I don't want to waste an inch of what was won for us through the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. That's available to everyone. That's the extravagant news of the Christian faith, that no one is excluded, no one is disqualified, no one need be disappointed with God. He has not socially distanced Himself from us. He's not asking us to quarantine from Him. He is available to us 24/7, and I actually just think it's a lifetime's work and beyond to mine the depths of that. And if I did, I might get close to realizing what it means to have this life in all its fullness. This kind of fixed steadfastness that even regardless of what life is throwing at us, there's a steadfast, there's a rootedness in us, that we're not actually dictated by what our circumstances are throwing at us, but we're guided and dictated by God who loves us and says, I love you, I offer you my comfort, my strength, my forgiveness.
I think that's a really helpful point to sort of come from a different angle. So we've talked a little bit about what's going on. I guess that sense of, we've started cosmically in the sense of what's God doing and where's this come from and how is it allowed to happen. I think for a lot of people the question therefore becomes, well, how do we get through this almost? And there'll be people watching this who may well be Christian, may have faith, may have known and loved the Lord for a number of years. There may be others watching who are coming from outside the church and outside the Christian faith. But there's a real question that comes through and came through certainly after you spoke to us the other week, which was effectively about how does God help us in our suffering? So we can know all these things about God and we can speak all these things about where this has come from and why it might be allowed to happen and what God might be up to. Yes. But there's also the question of, well, you know, we're 6 months in now, and lots of us are tired, and lots of people have lost loved ones. There's huge amounts of grief. There's a nation with financial questions, all sorts of different things. And the question then is, well, what does God offer in that? And how does God help us amidst a pandemic? And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that side of things as well.
When I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about, so I've been interviewing some people that have suffered greatly at the hands of kind of other kinds of natural disaster, and I interviewed one person who was a first responder at the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, and talked about how this entire village in Indonesia, about 3/4 of the village was entirely wiped out. There wasn't a single family in the village that hadn't had a bereavement of some kind. And he was saying that one of the things that they were able to bring, as well as bringing kind of, you know, medical aid and help in this setting, was actually sit and listen to the victims, because they couldn't talk to each other because everyone was in the same boat. I can't listen to your pain because I've lost family members as well. And so there was actually some benefit in talking to someone that was outside of their situation, and therefore could kind of provide fresh ears, as it were. But also, this person themselves wasn't totally alien to suffering. They had also experienced suffering, but of a different kind. And it struck me that that's a little bit like what it means to be able to relate to God in a kind of a time in our history when everyone has suffered in some way, whether that is kind of just the fatigue of having cabin fever and having everyone at home a little bit too much, or the sort of very acute grief of having lost loved ones, or you know, kind of things that are even to come on the back of not having had enough medical care and over the last few months. All kinds of suffering are out there and everyone is hurting. What help is God in that? Well, I think there's something that God, because he is transcendent, because he is outside of time and space, he is able to carry our burdens and bear our burdens when it feels like no one else around us really can, because everyone is hurting. But at the same time, he's not transcendent in a cold, aloof way. He does know what it is to suffer. In fact, we could argue that his suffering goes way beyond anything that we have ever experienced. He suffered his worst, most agonizing moments without the comfort of the Father, so that we, when we have our most agonizing moments, never need to suffer without the comfort of the Father, Father God. And so we can talk to a God who is able to carry our burdens, and it doesn't matter how heavy they are. Nothing is too heavy. I think sometimes we have these little phrases that we trot off, particularly in British culture regarding suffering, and one of them is there's always somebody worse off than you, as if that's a kind of, well, it might be a comfort to some people to know that actually it could be worse, but sometimes it can make us feel like, well, perhaps I shouldn't bring my suffering to God because he's got his hands tied with all of this other suffering going on in the world. But actually, God is not like a junior doctor in A&E on a Saturday night. His capacity to carry hurting people is without limit. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He's the beginning and the end, and he knows. And he says, come and talk to me. And you will find rest, you will find strength, you will find comfort, there is hope for tomorrow. And I guess with that, you know, how does God help us? I think one day at a time.
Yeah.
You know, I think we're told, Jesus tells us not to worry about tomorrow, not in a flippant way, not in a way that ceases to kind of plan or make plans that will help us, but just don't walk around with the burden of tomorrow, today. And there is something in that. I think ultimately the invitation from Jesus is, you can go through this without me or with me, and it is actually better with me. Hard as it might be, it's still better with a God who loves you and offers you strength and comfort and hope
Yeah, I've been reflecting a lot. There are some lines in a hymn that lots of people will know, which are as strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, which comes from a very old hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. And they feel to me like words that really speak to what Jesus gives us, that sense of he gives us the strength to get through each day. And actually for lots of people that at the moment is in and of itself a real challenge. And he also offers us bright hope for tomorrow. And just that beautiful sense that actually there is hope that lies ahead of us and hope in Jesus. And I think I've personally found that really helpful. And I suspect you probably have had a similar story of holding on to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that the pandemic is the current thing, but the truth is that we're wrestling and struggling with all kinds of things, and we were even before it hit. And so it's not just the pandemic that people are wrestling with, it's the things they were carrying even before that. But Jesus does say to us again, let me carry them. It's not for you to carry. Give it to me, talk to me, come to me. And my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I think it was John Mark Comer in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, that says we are not promised an easy life. We are not. But we are promised an easy yoke if we come to Jesus. And I just hang on to that.
That's a really beautiful thing, isn't it?
I
I wonder if you could, you talked a little bit about one of the things God offers at the moment is someone who is sort of above this, and not above this in a detached way, but someone we can talk to who comes from God's perspective, I guess. What would you say to someone who longs to pray and who wants to pray and who feels possibly at this time like almost feels like they're being drawn to pray but doesn't know what to pray?
So I would just actually say that it can often feel quite intimidating. I actually didn't grow up as a Christian, and I remember I became a Christian at the age of 20, and I can remember what it felt like as a non-believer being around people who were praying, and it felt awkward, and it felt like I needed to have some particular formula of words. But actually, what Jesus says is don't worry about complicated words. Just say what's on your heart. In some ways, that honesty and simplicity is really what God wants. So I would just say what's on your heart. And if it's a kind of a prayer, God, if you're there, please hear me, answer me. I just encourage you to, God loves that, and He hears us when we pray. And so no prayer is the wrong kind or the right kind, just be yourself. There's even a place for, and actually I think quite a big part of my prayer life is this form. The Bible talks about wordless groans, where there are no words for the prayer. Actually, it's just a kind of and that's prayer actually. And God is able to make sense of what's going on inside us, because He made us and He knows us better than we know ourselves. And He actually knows how you're wired. In a sense, He wired you that way. And so I would just say, I just encourage you to say what's on your heart. And if you're wanting to know if God is real, then He really does. I know that He responds to the God, if you're there, please hear me. And if there's something very specific that you really need to see or would like to see that He's real through seeing an answer to, there's nothing wrong with bringing that before God. And He's not kind of playing some sort of game of hide and seek with us. In some sort of tricking way. He actually wants to be known and wants to be found, and it says if you seek Him with all of your heart, you will find Him. That was my experience.
And I think we can overcomplicate it sometimes, can't, or feel like we have to have, that set model of what to pray. And actually, I love that idea of those times where we just go, oh, and actually that in and of itself is a prayer. Because I think lots of us recently have had moments of almost physically feeling that sense of just, and actually to know that
directed
Spirit,
to God, not to some other
not,
person.
not to our children. Exactly. That's really helpful. Just as we close, a couple of questions, again, just narrowing it in. What's this pandemic done to your faith?
I think so. It's very interesting. I think that so some of you will know our story about that my husband Conrad has had a sort of a periodic illness for much of our married life, for all of our married life, in fact, and for him going back to the age of 11. And so to struggle with physical limitations, to struggle with being a little bit housebound, to struggle with, that's actually not a new thing. And I'm sure that a lot of people listening, for them, that won't be a new thing either. It's just suffering in a different form. And it's very interesting, the effect that these things have on us over the long term, and just kind of that realization that my life is not my own. I belong to Jesus. I was bought at a price. I'm here to glorify him and to point other people to him. He is able to do all of that, even in the midst of a global pandemic, even in the midst of an illness in our family. Now Conrad is well at the moment and has been for a year or two. But I suppose my experiences before this and my sense of clarity about what it is to be a Christian and what I'm here on earth to do, it actually hasn't changed all that much. It's been frustrating, I'm not going to lie, but I think that really is how I sort of approach it. It's, I remember people saying about sort of 9/11, and we actually moved to America just 3 weeks after 9/11, that how the prevailing thought was that, oh my goodness, evil has broken into the world in a new way. Everything is different. And I remember this pastor standing up at the front saying, nothing is different. It's just we're seeing it in a different form. I mean, obviously, the world, the American people had experienced a great trauma, but it's actually it's another expression of evil.
Thank you. We started with Stephen Fry, and I wonder whether we might end with Stephen Fry. I don't know how likely this would be, but if you happened to find yourself in a lift with Stephen Fry, and you were, I don't know, you had a minute and a half in the lift, and you got to talking, and he discovered who you were, and you had your faith, I wonder what you'd say to him.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. I haven't been in a lift with Stephen Fry, but I did send him a copy of my book on suffering, along with another book from a friend on suffering. We didn't get a response or a reply. Who knows whether he read them. I know that he has spent time with Bear Grylls, who was a Christian. And what would I say? The problem with that is that, and this is the whole thing about how we sort of relate to others, that it's much better to be responding to a question than to be making statements to someone, because then it's a dialogue, not a monologue from me. So I guess it might be that, if there was one, what would it take for you to what kind of answer to prayer or kind of sign or whatever it is would you need in order to give your life to Jesus? What's stopping you from doing that? And of course, people have all kinds of answers that they give. Some are barriers in the intellect, some are barriers in the emotions and the heart, and these are complex. I'm sure that it's not simply an intellectual barrier for him, it's an emotional one as well. But God knows, and he loves everyone that he has made. And, you know, one of the questions, I think, is why doesn't God just get rid of it once and for all? And I think, you know, that is in some ways a very sobering question, because what we're asking in that question is, why doesn't God just get rid of all kinds of evil from the face of the earth now, once and for all? But the problem is that evil is pervasive in all areas of the created world, including the human heart. And it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn that said that the line dividing good and evil doesn't run through institutions or establishments, but through every human being. And so what we're saying is, you know, that God will remove all kinds of evil, including those who have not trusted Jesus to take care and deal with the evil that resides within them. And so this is actually a very sobering question. And on that day, we're also told that there will be judgment because God is love. This can often seem like an antithesis to a loving God, but it's actually the flip side of love, because God is not indifferent to evil. He does actually hate it and wants to rid the world of it. And therefore evil will be judged, which means that people who have committed horrendous crimes in this world, for whom even a just response from the law courts doesn't seem to be enough, will be brought to justice in a bigger and deeper way. And so, but that's a sobering thought when I think, okay, am I going to face that just on my own, or with the one who has no evil and yet has absorbed the power and presence of evil into himself, so that I can walk before God on that day knowing that Jesus is saying, this one is with me. And so the fact that God hasn't removed evil once and for all is actually a mercy to us. It's actually him showing patience with the human race, saying, I'm giving you time to think about these things seriously, to get your choices right, to really examine the evidence. Because if it's true that someone has walked this earth saying, I'm not just a human being, I'm God in human form, and has lived and died for us, and says that if we follow him, then death is not the end, that there is life beyond the grave for all who love and trust Jesus, then that's got to be worth looking into, because I'd want to be sure that I'm right. If I want to be sure that I've got it right, that I've drawn the conclusions that I have drawn correctly. And that's what I did in my 20s, in my late teens, and in my 20s, and so it's God giving us time, really, to do that, so that as many people as possible can actually benefit ultimately from this fullness of life that will last forever.
Sharon, thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground there, and I know that will be really helpful for lots of people, so thank you. You mentioned as well about people finding out more, and I think that's a really important thing for people to be able to do. We as a church here at St Andrews regularly try and provide opportunities for people to find out more. So you mentioned Alpha earlier. Alpha is it's a worldwide course these days, isn't it? It's been running for a long time, but it's a course specifically designed for people to bring these questions to, really, and to wrestle with them, to ask them in a safe place, and to really have a space, because often we don't have time to ask these questions. And I know you've had lots of experience with Alpha over the years and would heartily recommend it.
Absolutely.
So do keep an eye out. We run Alpha courses regularly at St Andrews. We've got one running this term in the autumn, and we'd love you to join that at some point. Details about that are up on our website, and will be at the bottom of this link with the video as well. But even if there's not a course running, we'd love to hear from you if you've got questions. There's lots of people around who can help wrestle with and ask these questions. So if that's you, if you're watching this and thinking, I just want to know more, this wasn't enough, or I want to find out more about this Jesus that you've been talking about, then we'd love to hear from you. There's lots of resources out there. Sharon has got some excellent books, so I would point you in that direction as well.
Or from the team at OCCA.
Yeah, and from the team at OCCA as well. There's a whole range of resources that are there. And again, that link for OCCA will be underneath this video too, so you can click through to find out about them. But just want to say thank you for watching. Thank you, Sharon, again for joining, for giving up your time and for helping us wrestle with these questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. You can always join us at St Andrews for our regular services. Details of all those are on our website. But all that's left to say is thanks for watching and goodbye.